Okay, hi everyone, it's Dr. Loyola here. As I said on Moodle, I'm going to be taking over instruction for this particular week. Um, and this week we are going to be focusing on usability. And I know in the original syllabus it says that we'll be doing usability and prototyping over these 2 weeks, but because of our shifts online and into this kind of new remote teaching environment because of COVID-19, we're shifting some of that about the syllabus and cutting those 2 weeks down to one. And we're just going to focus here on usability. I think that Dr. Boyle is going to tell you more about prototyping when she steps back into teaching near the end for your final projects. But for now, we are going to leave prototyping off and focus instead on usability. So in this video, which shouldn't be too long, in this video, I'm going to cover first, what is usability and why it's important to think about usability for any kind of product design. Not just web design, though I will pay particular attention to web design since, of course, that is what this class is about. Then we're going to look at Jakob Nielsen's 10 heuristics for usability, which are basically guidelines or rules of thumb for ensuring that a design is usable or that it should be usable. So it's more like a way to measure the potential for something to be usable before you do user testing. And it's also often used as a tool for evaluating how usable a design is or how usable, again, that a design should be. So we're going to talk a lot about that. That's going to take up the bulk of this video. And then I'm going to close by just going over your assignment for this unit, which is going to be a usability evaluation using Nielsen's 10 heuristics that I cover in this video. Okay, so first topic, what is usability and why is it important? So first, usability as a term is basically refers to how to measure or talk about or think about or understand how well your user interface design can be used by your basic, average, default everyday user. So first, to be clear, this is not about errors or usability of the code, right, or the buggy processing or anything like that. It strictly assumes that if everything else in the system is working, all the engineering is correct, all the architecture and infrastructure is there, if all that's working, can a user sit down with your design, with your interface design, and actually use that product or use that system for what it was meant to be used for? And we've talked about this a little bit, or we've kind of talked around it in the earlier unit you had with me about universal design and ensuring that users with disabilities can use a given design or a given interface. But this is actually considered even like more basic or before that. So this is like when starting a design, when laying out a web page, when creating an app, when building a machine that needs some kind of user interface, right, and so on. This is about guiding that design process so that people can actually use it when it's done, right? And so you're not just kind of shooting blindly in the dark with your design. So we also want to be clear that when we talk about usability and measuring how usable something is, it's not about like, does the user use it well, right? It's rather about, have you designed it in such a way that a user could easily, pleasantly, safely, successfully, right, all these other positive words for interacting with objects, that a user could do all of that with your design, right? So it's not about like if the user makes mistakes, it's not about the user going too fast for the design. It's like, have you done enough in that design process to make sure that even when users use your design under poor conditions, right? So when they're stressed out, when they're in a hurry, when they're not paying attention, can they still use it effectively? Right? Because as we all know, if something isn't easy or pleasant to use, and if you can't use it successfully with minimal frustrations, we're not going to use it, right? We're just not going to even bother with that product. We'll find another one because there's plenty on the marketplace. And besides just getting people to use your product, if we think kind of more expansively about legal ramifications and so on, like if a user, the other place where usability really comes into play is that if a user for some reason is injured using a product you've designed or hurts someone else due to a product you've designed, there's of course going to be investigations into whether that injury or that problem is the result of a design flaw, right? Something that you, the designer, or the company or whoever is responsible for, or is it something that just simple user error? right? And of course, there's like terms of service and EULAs and so on to help cover all that and help with the legal ramifications. But ultimately, this question also comes down to, was the product sufficiently designed so that the user didn't make an error, right? So was the error really just for the user, or was there something in the design that could have helped avoid some kind of accident, right? So basically, making sure that your designs are usable is important for everyone involved, right? For the designer, for the companies, for the users, anybody, the user's friends, right? Everyone involved. So while we've kind of established what usability is and why it's important, our next question, or kind of big topic area here, is in thinking about how we measure usability, right? How do we look at a design and say, oh yes, this should be very usable, or this is only kind of usable, it needs help in these areas, right? So you might be thinking like, oh, well, that's simple. We just have a set of criteria and then we just make sure each design has them, check, 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 and we're done. And in some ways it's that, but in a lot of ways it's not that, because every design doesn't need to be used in the same way, right? So every design can't need all of the same features, right? So if we think about this in terms of a vast array of products, like a website doesn't need a way to be like a gear shift, right? Or a car doesn't need a search bar, right? But a car needs a gear shift and a website needs a search bar because of the ways that they are used and they're meant to be used. If we even think more granularly just at web design, we can think of different purposes of websites and web-based products, and how even within those use cases, they will need different things and need to be used in different ways. So something like Spotify or Amazon, right, on the one hand, they have a lot of similarities, right? They both are web-based or mobile apps, so they both need to be used through a given hardware interface, right? They both need to be used with a mouse, a keyboard, a screen, a touch screen. So they have to be designed with that in mind. But then at the same time, right, Spotify's purpose is to provide users with music to stream, where Amazon's purpose is to help users find products to purchase. And because of those differences in use, they'll need different usable things. So Amazon will need things like a way to handle e-commerce, a way to explain to a user that they have chosen to buy certain items and they have chosen not to buy certain other items, some kind of detailed imagery and metadata about the product's materials, right? So how big they are, how heavy they are, what they're made of, right? They're going to need all kinds of additional usable content to help navigate that purpose of helping users buy stuff, right? Spotify, on the other hand, isn't going to need a lot of that, but it's going to need other things, right? So it's not going to need like a shopping cart, but it is going to need like a playlist creation option because that's something that people want to do with their music. Or it may not need detailed images and material metadata about an album, but it might need, I don't know, a way to connect with friends or artists for their users, right? Because listening to music is a social activity. So these are different kinds of use cases, right, for slightly different purposes, but we can kind of see, even with just these quick examples, that based on whatever the purpose of the design is, what people are supposed to use it for, right, that's going to actually drive what kinds of usability features are in the design. So it's not enough to just say like, oh, is there a button for this thing? Check, we're done. Instead, we need to kind of develop a way to measure usability that actually takes account of this, of all this variation, right, and all this variability for use cases. So to do that, we use what are called heuristics. And as I said at the beginning of this video, those are basically guidelines or rules of thumb for ensuring that an interface design should be usable, right? That's going to have a high potential for usability. And again, it's useful at the very beginning stages of a design to have some heuristics or have some guidelines, though I do want to make a note that as helpful as these things are, in the real world, right, in a real case scenario, that design would not simply follow heuristics. It would, of course, maybe start with heuristics and then go out for user testing, right? And you'd have alpha testers, beta testers, and so on before actually going to market or actually being put out in the world. And an original version of this class, when we were meeting hybrid, did have some user testing built in. But now that we are remote and kind of in this different model, broadly speaking, we are going to stick to heuristics and to learning about usability by evaluating a given design based on a set of heuristics or heuristic criteria that talk about its potential for being usable, right? So we are going to kind of limit it to just that one step of the process, but it is important for you to know that the process actually would start with heuristics and go through user testing and so on to make sure that the way that you've responded to each heuristic actually works for that user, right? So if that's still a little bit fuzzy for you, we are now going to turn to the bulk of this video, which is Jakob Nielsen's 10 usability heuristics. And hopefully that will kind of clarify a lot of what I've just said. So the industry standard for measuring usability before user testing are Jakob Nielsen's 10 heuristics for usability, right? And these are guidelines, again, rules of thumb for ensuring that there's a high likelihood of usability that's developed within a certain design, right? And as you're going to see as we go through these really are ways that help communicate with your user how to interact with the system in a given way, right? And how to interact in a way that is both effective and safe and pleasant for your user to go through, right? Because we don't want to be making our users mad with our design. So they basically are just listed in 10 lists. In a list as a list of 10. But I'm actually going to divide them into two broad categories for this lecture, just to help you kind of get a sense of what they're for. So category 1, which contains 7 heuristics, are basically heuristics that help by communicating for the user to do something right? So they help the user do the correct thing in the system. And then category 2 helps usability by kind of the flip side of that, which is by keeping the user from doing something wrong, right? So by not making errors, not making mistakes, or quickly recovering in the event that they do make an error or they do make a mistake. And again, just to be clear, this is about errors that the user makes in the interface, not about the code not working or something being buggy, right? That's not for the user to worry about. Okay, so category 1, helping the user do things right. So within this, we're just going to go through, as I said, there are 7 heuristics within this particular category, and we're going to start with heuristic 1, the visibility of the system status. So this heuristic essentially says that the system should always keep users informed about what's going on by giving them some kind of appropriate feedback within a reasonable amount of time, right? So not feedback 5 hours later or feedback even a minute later in some cases, but often immediate feedback or responsive feedback that lets them know what the system is doing or what the status of the system is at any given time. So some common examples of this are things like the speech ball from Apple, which basically tells us, oh, the system is processing or the system is thinking, don't do anything, it's working, right? Similarly, we have things like the loading screen in Gmail, which says loading and gives you this progress bar, right? And those kind of serve that same purpose, which is to say, don't do anything right now, the system is working, right? So some other examples of this are things like the blinking cursor in a Word document, which actually says, hey, user, feel free to do something. I'm waiting on your input, right? Like that's what that communicates to us, that's what the system status is waiting for user input. On our phones, we have things like the online and offline things to indicate when we are using Wi-Fi or when we're using data. We also have like a battery life indicator, which tells us that our hardware has some amount of power left. And then finally, we can look to something like tabs in a web browser like Chrome or Firefox, and the way that the tab that you're actually on gets a slightly different coloration so that you can clarify where you are in the system, right? So again, that's the visibility of system status. That is our first heuristic. Our second heuristic says that you should maintain a match between the system and the real world. And this is, again, just kind of thinking about ways that users will understand what you're communicating to them in your interface. So basically, it says that users are going to make assumptions about what something is for based on what they know about the real world. So some examples of this are all over your desktop. So the trash can as an icon, which means get rid of something by putting it here, right? Of course, it's not a literal trash can, but the purpose there is to assume that we know what trash cans are for in the real world. So now we can make that connection in the system. And finally, we can look to something like the shopping cart in Amazon, which helps us understand, like, okay, these are the things that I'm trying to buy. They're in my shopping cart, again, because in the real world, we have the such thing as shopping carts, and we put the stuff we're going to buy in them, right? So this is just building out a strong sense of metaphoricity that helps users understand what everything is for because of what they match in the real world. Okay, our third heuristic is user control and freedom. And this has to do with helping users feel safe in your design and in your system by giving them freedom to move around, right? So not constraining them to only one pathway, but at the same time, always having clearly marked exits in case they go somewhere they don't want to be, right? So this is things like the back button on your browser, undo options in like every word processor or Excel or Adobe thing ever. Um, Options to recover recently deleted content in case things are deleted on accident, or these little X's to X out of windows and screens or programs, right? So ways to clearly get out of something that you don't want to be in without committing to something that you don't want to do, right? So that's our user control and freedom, is making sure that they have freedom to move around, but also they're controlled within those movements and don't get into a circumstance you don't want to be in. Okay, our fourth heuristic is consistency and standards. So this is basically a heuristic which says, similar to match between the system and the real world, this says that you need to recognize that your users do not use products in a vacuum, right? They're not going to come to your design fresh, but rather they're going to come to your design, and their understanding of what's in your design is always going to be informed by everything they've done before. So other web apps, other web pages, other things they've used that are similar to what your design is working in. And so it should try to maintain some of these same standard practices of design so that your users, again, aren't facing something totally new. So some examples of this are like the functionality of copy paste, right? That is something that works across platforms, across programs, everywhere. So it's a consistent standard practice that we can expect to do anywhere that we are. If we want to get a web page from our location bar, we can do that with copy paste, just like we can copy paste between Word documents, right? Similarly, the blinking cursor on a Word doc, in addition to indicating the status, which is user input now, it also means, because it means type here, right? That's again not something that exists in the real world. We don't ever see blinking cursors outside of a computer, but now that has become the standard, which says you can type in this area. Right? So even outside of like a Word doc, you can see blinking cursors and understand that you're meant to type something there. And then one final example of this is something like the hamburger menu, which is a relatively new design, right, within kind of the language of web design. But that now, because it's been used in enough designs, again, we see those three lines up in the top left, and we know, okay, I can click that and get a full menu open, right? So those are just a few examples of things that are, as I said, related to the match between the system and the real world, but often don't have a counterpart in the real world, but rather are just used across apps and across programs. So it's consistent within digital design. Okay, our fifth heuristic is recognition rather than recall. So this has to do with how you communicate to users where they are, or how users know where they are in your system. And so what you want to do is you want to help them in your design actually identify where they are and how they've gotten where they are. So instead of forcing them to remember everything that they've done to get to where they are, right? So instead of forcing them to remember all the steps that they took, because that's actually quite a heavy mental load, instead we want to design in a way that makes it really easy for them to recognize where they are. So again, I've already shown an example of like a highlighted tab. That again kind of says this is where you are within this mess of browser tabs. Another example of this is something like breadcrumbs in Amazon, or even in our own trusty Moodle, which tells you here's the process that you've taken to get here, here's the site architecture, and here are the steps that you've done. So you can go back to any given step along the way, right? And you can kind of see where you are within the site's architecture. Okay, our sixth heuristic within this category is flexibility and ease of use. And this is about recognizing that each user, even though you want to kind of design for your default generic user, right? Actually, each user is entirely unique and will be coming to your design with different requirements, different skill sets, different limitations, and your design should aim to accommodate all of these types of users. And often when this is talked about, it's talked about with thinking about not necessarily disability, as we did earlier in the semester, but rather thinking about beginning users versus professional users when designing an interface. So you want your beginners to be just as comfortable in that design as your professionals, right? And you also want your professionals to be able to have the things that they need with an ease of access that's maybe a bit quicker or a bit more direct than what the beginning user needs. So the most common example of this is something like keyboard shortcuts, right? So in this case, you can do Command C, Command V, and that's a real quick copy paste, which the expert user knows, but that perhaps the beginning user doesn't know. So perhaps the beginning user is going to go edit, copy, edit, paste, right? Or to even be more expansive than just this, we can look at the Adobe Adobe Creative Suite keyboard shortcuts, which has basically anything you could need to do in Adobe just from your keyboards if you know those shortcuts. So again, that's accommodating the expert user by creating flexibility within that design, but at the same time, it's not so overwhelming for the beginning user because it's easy to use and flexible for everyone. Okay, and then our seventh and final heuristic within this first category is aesthetic and minimalist design. And this is something that is a little bit funky because it's the only one that really kind of speaks to taste. But the goal here isn't necessarily about being on trend or using like good colors necessarily, but it's instead about keeping things ordered, right? And designing in a way to reduce clutter and make it really clear what your user is supposed to do or where they can find certain things in your design because of the way that you use things like spatial separation or colors that indicate a visual hierarchy or something like that. So for this, let's look at something like Facebook and Twitter. So both of these sites are actually relatively cluttered in terms of information, especially Facebook. Like there's a ton going on this screen, and it's just kind of a mess. But at the same time, what we see in both sites is we see a focus on the center as the feed. We have this kind of three columns across of different types of information with menus on the left side and then additional info on the right, and then the primary feed in the center. And if we look specifically to the user input field, so the field where you might do a status update on Facebook or a tweet on Twitter, there we see it actually becoming increasingly minimalist. And it's really just focusing on what the user can actually contribute in that particular moment, right? So it's getting rid of all the rest of that noise and just helping the user use it in a way to contribute or to communicate or post or whatever it is they want to do by minimizing what else is around, right? By just focusing on these are the 5 options you have. This is it. Ready, go. Okay, so that's what we mean by aesthetic and minimalist design is about, on the one hand, making it look good, but really it's about keeping things organized and reducing noise and clutter. Okay, so now we'll move on to our final 3 heuristics, which all fall into the second category, which is keeping users from doing the wrong things or helping users if they do the wrong things. So the first heuristic within this category is error prevention, right? And this is just like it sounds, it's literally designing in such a way that you keep users from making mistakes. So we want to be aware that when users make mistakes in a system, it tends to be for one of two reasons. Number one, they're going too fast, they're not paying attention. Maybe they've used this app hundreds of times, or whatever the case may be, and they slip up, right? Or maybe their thumb hits the wrong button on a touch screen because it's just a little bit too small or something like that. So just these kind of small slips, but they understand what they're supposed to do. They've just made a little mistake. The second reason they make mistakes is is not the opposite, but kind of harder to design for, and that is that they just don't understand what they're supposed to do in your design, right? They don't understand that they're supposed to type something, or they don't understand that they're supposed to click a button, or that they're supposed to scroll, or whatever the case may be. And that one, as I said, is harder to design for, but that's what all of these heuristics are kind of meant to help you avoid, is to help you communicate so users understand what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to do it. So error prevention is a little bit more about that first type, which is keeping users from making these little slips or these little mistakes. So for these to design well for error prevention, you can do things like using confirmation dialogues, right? So making users click OK, or I definitely want to do this, or to confirm that they want to delete a file, right? So often these are used, you've probably noticed, when there's something potentially destructive about to happen, right? They're maybe about to delete something or make a big purchase, right? And there could be real consequences for this action. So often when that happens, you'll get that kind of confirmation dialogue. This is like, yes, I definitely understand, get rid of it, right? Or buy it, or whatever the case may be. Another way to help with this heuristic that's often pointed to is to set constraints or even examples so that users know what to do when they're meant to input something. So for instance, if you look at like an upload option, perhaps listing file types that the upload will accept. Or when you're entering a date on a form, for instance, you might put in a model for how to enter that date, or guidelines for creating a password, which says like this password needs, an uppercase letter, a lowercase letter, a special symbol, and a number. Okay, our second heuristic in this category is helping users recognize, diagnose, and recover from errors. So this is about when users make an error, because they always will, right? You need to help them, one, see that they've made an error, two, understand why they've made this error and what the error is, and then three, fix it, right? So recover from that error. So this says that errors should always be expressed in plain language. So direct communication, not code, not jargony, so that it precisely indicates the problem and helps offer a solution. So we've seen a lot of bad examples of this, right? We've all seen error messages like these that just give you, some random gibberish of code. You have no idea what you've done wrong or how to fix it, and it really doesn't help anything happen within this system. So some better error messages are things like creative 404 errors, which help visually explain like, oh, we can't find this site, and at the same time, hopefully keep users engaged on your site so they don't, just give up on your product and your design and leave. Or this particular one where if you have an error of not finding a username, it says very clearly, we can't find this username, and then also offers a direct option right there to help find the username, right, or to create a new account. So it gives you the problem, it makes it clear what's gone wrong, and helps you fix it by creating an account. Okay, and then finally, our last heuristic, both in this category and overall, is help in documentation. And this one just says that even though you want to design to avoid users having to go to the documentation, right? They need to know how to use your product based on your design. You always need to provide the help and documentation. And that information itself should be easy to search, focus on the user's task, and it should list concrete steps to carry out. And it shouldn't be so overwhelmingly large that users can't use it or don't use it. So I'm just going to show you one example of this. This is something like the help process in Pages. So this is how to add an image, and you can see that it gives you these nice little like blue toggle points that help kind of show you where to go within the system so that you can navigate how to add an image in something like Pages. So this comes directly from the help menu. I could open the entire user's guide, but this has kind of given me an optional use so that I can do it without opening that huge document, right? Okay, so that takes us through our 10 usability heuristics. I hope that you kind of have a sense of what everything is between the examples and the explanation. Below this video on Moodle, I've linked you to a few other resources, which you're welcome to use to kind of help guide this assignment. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about the assignment and then sign off. So the assignment that you're going to be doing is a heuristics evaluation of two interfaces of the same site. So what I mean by that is that you should pick a site, ideally one that you use a lot and that you go to frequently, that must be both browser-based, so you need to be able to access it from like Firefox or Chrome or Safari or whatever, and it needs to have a mobile app. Okay, so it needs to have both of these places. And then using these 10 heuristics as a guide, look through both of these interface designs and identify first how the design handles each heuristic at all, right? So this site indicates visibility system status by X. 2, how well the site handles that heuristic, right? So this is a good communication. This communication is just okay. This communication is great, whatever the case may be. So how well it handles each heuristic. And then 3, how it might be improved, if at all. Okay, so in many cases, you may not have much for option 3, since of course the designs we're using exist in the real world, which means that they've been assessed by these heuristics, that they've been user tested, right? And they're probably basically good, or you wouldn't use them, right? But that doesn't mean that designs can't be improved just because they exist in the world, right? So even if there are things that you're like, well, this actually might be better if it was on a different part of the page, or if it was a different color scheme, right, or something like that, even just those small things are worth noting for option 3 as to how something might be improved. On Moodle, I've offered you a form that you're all welcome to use to help with this, that just helps kind of guide you through this process. And what I'm primarily looking for is to see that you understand these heuristics, you can identify them in the wild, and you can evaluate how effective they are in any given design. Okay. As always, please feel free to reach out to me via email for any questions or any other issues that arise. This assignment is due next Monday, April 13th by 5 p.m. So all of that will be up on Moodle, and you should see that clearly indicated. But of course, you're welcome to email with any questions or any other issues. And I look forward to seeing what sites you evaluate and what you make of their designs.